Great. Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to the 5th session in the Spring 2020 Sunoikisis Digital Classics program. This session is the second of 2 sessions on EpiDoc and is presented by Simona Stoyanova from the University of Nottingham, Martina Filosa from Köln, and myself, Gabriel Bodard from the Institute of Classical Studies. And we're also joined by Dimitar Iliev from the University of Sofia. Hi all. I believe Simona is going to start us off and give us an introduction to the session. Just a quick note that if you're watching this live on YouTube, that is to say if it is 4 p.m. GMT where you are now, then please leave a note in the live chat on YouTube and say hi, let us know you're there, and feel free to join the discussion and ask questions there. If you're watching this later, welcome. We're delighted to have you watching this, but you can't join the live chat. Over to Simona.
Hello. So I'll start with a brief introduction to the outline of this session, which is looking into the publishing of EpiDoc files with the use of the EFES publication platform. So first off, I'll briefly introduce how we transform XML files for publication. Then Gabby is going to talk us through the motivation for the creation of EFES to begin with, followed by Martina, who is going to give us a demo of how to install and start EFES for the first time. Then we are going to discuss 2 case studies, which both use EFES, the Cretan Institute inscriptions and CityDoc. And we will finish the session with a discussion among the 4 of us about an EFES workflow for publication, for work, for designing your own project, putting it online, etc. So I think I can start off with the first part. I don't know why I have this white. Okay, the white stripe disappeared. Good. So a couple of weeks ago, the Sunoikisis session was focused on text encoding. So now that we have covered how to encode our text, let's have a look at what we can do with those texts. So one obvious thing that we can use visualization for, and in the first instance I'll talk only about visualizing our XML files, is to proofread what we've actually encoded both structurally and semantically. We annotate, and then when we publish our files, in this instance through the EFES platform, we can see the addition that we're aiming to produce, and then if something has gone wrong, we can go back to our XML files and correct accordingly. Another thing which we can do with our encoded files is to index our corpus. So if we have multiple files, we can produce things like an index of places or names, etc., with information extracted from the encoding that we've produced in the first place. Similar for various kinds of textual or structural analysis. By the publish point here, I mean publishing the entire corpus, not just one text for proofreading, which is more complex because the first thing we need to do is design our edition, think what we actually want to produce, for whom, what is our audience, how to structure it best. And that is to an extent guided by the type of encoding we've produced, to extent guided by user experience. And the last point is about interchange. So we advocate the use of standards and best practices, which means that we can then our files and our materials can be interoperable with other projects that use the same standards and best practices. So how do we actually achieve those things? There are 2 main ways. One is transforming the text, meaning we transform our XML files via something else, which is coming into the next slide, transforming it from XML to something else, be it an HTML web page or a PDF or another kind of publication. The other thing that we briefly touched upon in the index and analysis part is extracting information from our encoded text and presenting it in a different way outside of the XML records for each individual text. So one of the major benefits of the use of XML is the fact that from a single output, from a single file, we can produce multiple different visualizations of our material depending on what we need and what we're aiming to do. And that is achieved, it can be achieved several different ways. The main thing that we use currently in the EFES platform is the XSL programming language, which is specifically an XML transformation language. XQuery, similar. There are other ways of manipulating XML text. Other programming languages not specifically designed to work with XML have, however, XML-aware libraries that we can use to transform and manipulate our texts. Another option is to use web languages like CSS and JavaScript to extract and change specific bits of our XML. That doesn't necessarily work for all the indexing features, for example, that we might want in an epigraphic edition, but all three options are out there. They exist, they're quite well documented and represented. Depending on what we need, we can use a mixture of them, not necessarily stick to only one of these three methods of transformation. Common outputs, for example, are different media, websites, as we mentioned, HTML as an output format, or various print or print-on-demand formats. We can produce from the same encoded XML file, we can produce different visualizations, an editorial, a diplomatic, various other kinds, including educational, for example. And another possibility, which we mentioned in the indexing bit, is extracting specific kinds of information across our corpora and presenting them in, for example, a table of content. So this is a brief explanation of the XSLT transformation process. On the left-hand side, we see a number of XML files. It could be just one, it could be several. We see then the next step is the XSL transformation script, which processes that file and produces, after that transformation, an HTML output, which, with the help of a bit of CSS to make it look more user-friendly, can result in a web page. So here I've listed just a few tools for publishing XML corpora. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. This is also mainly targeted at TEI-based publications. So the ExistDB applications allow the creation of applications coupled with database management and corpus management. It's based on XQuery rather than XSLT. It does allow the uses of XSLT, but mainly operates on XQuery. The next one, the TEI publisher, is actually built on ExistDB. And it is, as the name suggests, it was designed to work with TEI files, and the manipulation of information outside of XML is minimal because the TEI publisher is using the TEI processing model. So all changes are made in the XML with brief possible inclusions of CSS, but mainly XML, so there is no need for learning 3 other programming languages to publish a corpus. TAPAS stands for TEI Archiving, Publishing and Access Service, and that's mainly a repository for long-term storage, but also for access to TEI XML projects. There is a shared TEI search, so people can explore and search across the various projects archived in TAPAS. There is a basic kind of number of viewing options which are built into TAPAS. Currently, you cannot upload your own XSLT, but you can collaborate with the developers of TAPAS to include your viewing options into the set defaults that they have. EVT is another option. It was designed around manuscripts initially, which means that it has very rich support for critical edition. Publication, the apparatus criticus options are numerous and complicated. There's things like variant heat map, witness collation. They have produced also linkage between text and image. It's very, very rich tool, specifically for complex critical editions. It works quite well, and it's built version 1 on XSLT, version 2 is moving towards JavaScript, but you can still use XSLT. And then we have the EpiDoc style sheets on which EFES was built. And we're going to look at how we transform our epigraphic corpora in EFES with those style sheets in a moment. That was from me. Now, moving back to Gabby.
Great, thanks, Simona. Yeah. So yes, in the context of that, then I'll talk about how EFES came about and what we aimed for EFES to, what the goals were, and so forth. So just the motivation. So very quickly then, this is what we give you when you go to EFES. There is documentation and there is software, and you basically take the parts and put them together along with your text. So the idea behind this was that so for upwards of 15 years we've been teaching EpiDoc to various audiences, and we have now certainly hundreds of people who have been taught EpiDoc, at the very least dozens of people who have been using EpiDoc in their own projects. The Digital Classicist Wiki lists about 80 EpiDoc projects. I'm sure there are maybe not double that, but certainly many more than that, including so many that we haven't referenced. But a lot of people who come to EpiDoc training events or who learn EpiDoc in other contexts, they will come up with the question, well, what do I do with this file? I've marked up a dozen or 100 or 1,000 inscriptions or papyri in TEI XML, in EpiDoc XML, or I've grabbed some of these interchangeable files from papyri.info or from Eagle, and so I've got 1,000 files that I've filtered out from those large EpiDoc collections that I can then modify and make a mini collection of my own from. But how do I publish that? What do I do with that? All the big corpora that are published using EpiDoc do so. Although the very big corpora have all done so either with very large grants. So famously, the Inscriptions of Aphrodisias, one of the first large corpora published using EpiDoc, ran over 3 years and cost £300,000 of research funding at the time for the research team, including developers and researchers and so forth, to work on that. And that was a lot of money. And a lot of people at the time, not unreasonably, said, "Well, EpiDoc is clearly very expensive to use. That sounds too much for me. I'm gonna do this, some other way." Not I mean, the counter argument to which was that that these projects were in many ways creating tools which could then be reused by others. But that wasn't necessarily obvious, and it wasn't necessarily easy. A lot of the other projects who don't necessarily do this with $500,000 or $1 million worth of funding in today's money. Did so because they have a digital humanities team or an electronic publishing team behind their project, a good institution or department in their university who are able to support them throughout this project. So some of the projects coming out of Oxford or Brown University have done this without necessarily millions in funding, but with good support in-house. Many people don't have either that huge amount of money or that amount of support in-house to build their tools. So what's happened to them? Are they just out of luck, or what can we do to support them? So the idea of EFES was precisely to be this tool that was easy enough to use, that you didn't need a massive team behind you, and that was functional enough that you didn't need a large amount of money to develop something from scratch. And so what we developed was this publication platform using a publication tool called Köln, which was developed by King's College London, which had also been used as the backbone for several EpiDoc publications already. So it was easy to customize in that way. It was an open source tool, so we were able to build on it. And EFES is also an open source tool, and on top of Köln, it uses the EpiDoc reference style sheets that Simona already mentioned as the basic driver for displaying individual inscriptions. It introduces several sample indexes coded in XSLT and internally, and also search facets for creating the kind of multiple layers of nested search that you see in some of these kinds of publications, and both of those things came out of existing EpiDoc projects, and we were able to borrow XSLT and Solr code from them to generate these indexes and search facets. It has a native Sesame triple store in the back end, so a lot of the searching is done by the use of the underlying RDF. And most importantly, while there are a few sample indexes, sample display styles, and so forth, and there's a basic interface, which Martina will show you in a minute, all of these things are customizable, and they are easy to customize. And they're very well documented, so that even if you're not a programmer, even if the only coding that you've ever done is marking up EpiDoc XML, you can, with the help of this documentation, in principle, in practice, a little bit more support may be needed in the short term, be able to work out how to customize the various parts of that tool. So that's where we got to. That was always the goal with EFES. I think we're 8/10 of the way there, let's say. We have maybe not quite enough indices in there for everybody, to cover 90% of everybody's needs. So there's all sorts of indices that maybe everybody would like, but that we don't have in there as samples yet. They will come as people customize them. We'll say, well, you've created that index. Can we have it back in the main body of EFES now? And so forth. And there's a few other functions that we would really like to have in there that we that just don't exist yet for this tool, which we can discuss a bit more later, perhaps. But I think we're in a pretty good place, as we'll see with the two case studies that we'll see shortly. People were able to take EFES and go off and adapt it for their own projects. So I guess here I will hand over to Martina, who will show you EFES.
Okay, thank you, Gabby. Hi, everyone. So I will just switch right now to the page that Gabby already showed you. But before we begin, I mean, this one will be our Bible, kind of. As Gabby already said, EFES is very well documented. Everything you need to know is actually in this user guide and in the wiki. You will need pretty much nothing else than what you find here. So I will not show you everything of EFES or the core of EFES, but I will try and teach you how to install and how to run EFES. But a small caveat before we begin. Before you start thinking of using EFES, you have to make sure, first of all, that your inscriptions are in valid XML files encoded according to the EpiDoc standards. So this is a condition sine qua non, so to say. Then you have to be sure that you have only one file per inscription. So if you have 1,000 inscription, you will need 1,000 XML files. So this is what you need to know in order to begin. So in order to start with EFES, you have to go to the GitHub repository and to the user guide of it, which is to be found in the wiki. You scroll down to the quick start, which I think Gabby is showing you right now on the slide. And in order to download your EFES, you have to click on this on this download button, which I won't do because I already did it before starting. So I will. This is the EFES that I downloaded, and please be sure that all of the files are unzipped, because when you download your EFES, it will automatically zip all the files, but you have to be sure to unzip it because otherwise it won't work. So in order to launch EFES, you will go inside the EFES master file, and if you are a PC user, you will click on this build file, and if you are a Mac user, you will click on the build shell file. Since I'm a laptop user, I will just click here, and it will launch automatically a command line, and you see it tells us that the server is running here. When you will have to double click on this HTTP address, just copy and paste it into a browser, which I will do. And so it's very quick. Sometimes it can happen that you will have to wait a couple of minutes or more, according, first of all, to the power of your laptop, and second, according to how many files you have on your EFES. This one is the standard EFES version, so it has a bunch of files, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20, so it doesn't take much time to run. So a very quick discussion about browsers, because this is maybe something that we can discuss afterwards during the discussion bit. But for example, for the project that we are developing, which Gabby already talked about, CGDoc, the browser that we are using is Mozilla Firefox, because we have some fonts which are not displayed well in other browsers. So just that you know that if something doesn't display well, you might want to change browser for a bit. So welcome to EFES, as the webpage is saying. I will show you just very quick how EFES is structured. It is actually a folder within a folder within a folder. And for example, here in root, in web apps, sorry, root and then content, XML, EpiDoc, here is where you will store all of your XML files. So if you have already encoded some inscriptions or some texts, you might want to drag them here in this folder, which lives set aside in web apps, root, content, XML, EpiDoc, in order for them to be displayed. And for example, your images, you will have to store them here in the folder named images. Or for example, we have, these are all things that I will mention later, but so that you've heard of them. We have the folder authority, where all of our authority lists are stored, and I will go back to authority lists in a minute. But so that you see that the structure of EFES is actually very intricate at the beginning, but once you get to know it, you will just know where to click and where to browse. So let's go to the display. So best practice is always to have the admin link open in another tab, because it will go to the admin tab all the time, and you don't want every time to go back and forth. So just have it open somewhere. You see this nice buttons, index all and harvest all. We'll come to that in a minute, so that you know that by clicking on the button index all, you will make sure that all of your XML files are there, that all of the new versions of your XML files are there. And I can just make an example about that. I will just drag a couple of files from my own EFES copy to it, so that you know how to index them. So this is my private copy of EFES, and here is the right one, I hope. Yes. Web apps root, content, XML, EpiDoc. There we go. But it's not enough to have put them here in this folder. I also have to index them in order for them to appear. So let's wait a couple of seconds. So everything looks fine, and we have also our nice XML files. So before you start, you want to create an RDF repository. So what is an RDF repository? Polina Jordanova says it here in her amazingly well documented wiki for EFES. So why we want to create an RDF repository? So which are the main functions of EFES? First of all, to display your corpus of inscription, but also to create indices and to search for terms, search within the indices, and so on and so forth. So the indices are actually based on authority lists. And in order to populate your authority lists, it is best practice to always harvest RDF from your authority lists. And in order to use these capabilities of Köln, you have to make this small step at the very beginning, but it's only actually once. You won't have to do it more. So we just follow what the EFES user guide is telling us, and we will click here on this link. And wait, I should have opened it in another tab so that we can still have a look at the guidelines. So what do? We go to new repository, type this one, ID, we will say Köln, and we go to next. We leave everything as default, and then we create it. So congrats, you just created a RDF repository. It's as easy as that. So now we can close everything and go back to our EFES, and to our admin tab. And now we can harvest all our authority lists. Yes, so this error which is given to us, it's actually, it has to be there because it's part of an exercise. but you can see that everything succeeded, and that's amazing. So now we are all set, I think, and I can show you a little bit around EFES and get you to know a little bit more what you can do with that. So as you can see, this is the default page, and as Gabby said before, EFES is a very well customizable platform, and you can customize pretty much everything. So here, I mean, starting from the XML files to the search interface, going up to this welcome to EFES. If you don't like it, if you don't fancy it, you can write whatever your the title of your project is. So now I already told you about the admin and about the indexing and harvesting. So now every inscription that we have should be there. So let's go to inscriptions, and yes, here we have everything. So these are the samples that that EFES gives us, that the pristine EFES gives us, and these are the three XML files that we dragged in while we were doing this demo. So now we can go to the indices of various facets of inscription data, that is the indices. And as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. But of course, you can add more, or you can delete some of them if your project don't need them. And everything that I'm saying, as I already said, is in the user guide. So there you will learn how to add an index, or to delete indices, and to play a little bit around. So let's have a look at the personal names index. So as you can see, pardon, the index of personal names is here, and on the under the name part of this table, you will have, of course, the the name of the item, in this case the personal name, and on the right hand side you will have the reference, so where this name is to be found, in which inscription is to be found. And if we have square brackets around it, it means that this name, this occurrence has been restored. So let's just have a look at it. And here it is. We have the name Akesandros, and it is indeed here, and it was attested. Where it was here. It was attested twice within the same inscription. Once, extended, and the other one, restored. So it is indeed once here and once restored. So Simona was talking about XSLT transformation, and XSLT, based on the XSLT style sheets that EFES already gives to you, you can create, for example, this edition tab, where on one hand you have the interpretive edition, and on the other you have the diplomatic. So these are the default values for interpretive and diplomatic, so just capital Greek. But as you will see in a couple of minutes, everything is customizable. So you can also customize the display of your edition of both interpretive and diplomatic. Let's have a look at something very interesting of EFES, that is the search interface. Also, this everything customizable, and the coolest feature of EFES is, in my opinion, the date slider. You can see that this is actually a filter for the dating, and as you can see here, it goes from 475 BCE to 1600 AD. And now we want to have all of the inscriptions from 25 AD to 675 AD. Not much. But as you can see, we have a faceted search in EFES, and also here you can add all of the facets that you need for your project. Of course, for an epigraphic project, it's very relevant to have the found provenance. And here, as you can see, everything is takes back to a gazetteer, to a geographic gazetteer, or the origin place, or the source repository, support material, object type, and date, origin date evidence. And let's say that we only want all of these inscriptions for which the date evidence is based upon the lettering. So it's only the 3 of them. Just have a look at it. That's actually very interesting. Yeah. And we can understand why the evidence is based on the lettering. So what else can I show you of EFES? The very one of the most interesting features, which also speaks of community, so to speak. Oh, not this one. Sorry. Let's go to Yospay. Is that you can download everything as a full EpiDoc XML. You can download each and every inscription from the corpora as a full EpiDoc XML, or you can download the whole bunch of inscription as a zip archive. Here I see bibliographic concordances, but yes, I'm not sure that we can work on this pristine version of EFES with bibliography. Oh, sorry. Let's go home from here. And I think that's all from me for now. Unless you guys think that there's something I missed and that I should say at all, by all means.
I would like to add that before you run EFES, and I think this is also in the guidelines, you should have Java installed on your computer. And well, sometimes when you start running it, it misbehaves, and it's usually because you don't have Java. So you go to the Java web page and you install whatever version there is available. I think version 8 works best, but it changes. So
yeah, I
8 could do.
Yes, sorry, I completely forgot to say that. And of course, yes, it's also written in the guidelines, but you have to, you should have Java installed, and you can check which version of Java you have and download it accordingly. And yes, because otherwise it will just behave crazy and just won't display anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's a more general rule, which is that, as with any software, there are system requirements. And with EFES, we believe that on almost every computer, it will now work out of the box, but just occasionally something doesn't work as expected. And if so, look at the system requirements and they will give you a few suggestions, such as check what version of Java you're running. And if your computer is running a much more recent version of Java because it's a new machine, etc., then you can install the older version of Java alongside the newer version. And there's instructions for all of that. And the same is true for various other system requirements that there may be that you would need. Most of what you need comes with EFES as part of the download bundle. If there are any errors that you don't understand based on your system setup and requirements not being met, the general rule is that unless it's a bug with EFES itself, which is not impossible, but they tend to look slightly different, if it's that your system is not currently configured for whatever reason, you should go to the person you normally go to fix your system if something goes wrong with that. So whether that's, you know, your machine's still under warranty, or you have an IT department in your university, or a local IT shop that works well for this, or you've got a genius friend in the physics department who you buy drinks to keep them sweet, that's who you should go to. We in general can't help with that sort of thing. These are very rare problems, though. I wouldn't be at all surprised if nobody attempting to follow this session has those problems. But it is worth looking out for. And Java, as Dimitar says, is the most common one. Yeah.
And it also comes with very thorough and very detailed technical documentation. So if something isn't quite running right, your computer whiz should know, should be able to guess what they have to touch in order to make it work.
Right. And also worth bearing in mind that when you go to your genius friend in the physics department and you say, I've got a problem with X, the first thing they will do is they will look at the error message and they will copy and paste it into Google. So you could try doing that as well first, yeah, because that might give you the answer even before, and then you could brag and say, well, I fixed this. Cool. Shall we move on to the case studies then? Okay.
Yes, fine with me.
Then the first one, I believe, is the Cretan inscriptions case study. So for this, I'm going to show a site that the only public facing version of information about is this description of the PhD thesis on which this project is based. So I've been given permission by the author, Irena Vajranakis at Venice, to show the private version of her site, which is based on EFES, but is not yet published. So take this with the double caveat that this is as brilliant as it is unfinished and unpublished, and B, it is not my work, and so I can't really describe it in as much detail as I should. The site basically looks like this. So if this were a website, and you can't tell that it's not, right? This is a customization of EFES. You can see it looks a lot more attractive than the out-of-the-box version of EFES, because Irene has gone behind the scenes and modified the CSS and the XML to give slightly more content. You can see that it's basically the same layout. It has a title at the top. It has three boxes in the middle and some menus up here. So it is basically using the same content. It's just been jazzed up a little bit, and this is probably the most basic customization of EFES that you could do. So I don't mean that as a criticism of the site. I mean just in terms of how easy this would be to do for yourself if you were customizing your own version. And so what she's included in here is she has her inscriptions. She has some 600 inscriptions. She has the catalog of inscriptions here, the table of contents, as it were. She has each inscription. There's been a slight customization of the display of the inscription. This is all in Italian, by the way. As well as being able to download the EpiDoc XML behind this, you can also, she has designed it so that you can download this inscription as a PDF file. That required only a relatively small customization of the XSLT. That customization has since been fed back into the EpiDoc reference style sheet. So if you wanted to export PDF of your inscriptions in EFES, you can now do so without having to learn XSL formatting objects, thanks to Irene having learned it for us, which is a great relief to me because I hope never to have to learn XSL formatting objects. So this has, the sort of display you expect to see from an inscription. It has the basic tabular information about it, and then it has the text itself, bibliography, and then some free text running commentary with cross references and bibliography and so forth down the side there. She has also modified the search interface somewhat. partly just to give it a slightly different skin, but partly also to use a different series of facets. The facets are these things behind on the left here that you can use to filter through your search that Martina's already showed us. So I think we do need to do something at the EFES level about making the facet area a little bit more user-friendly, because at the moment we have the facet bibliographical reference highlighted, and that means we have to scroll until we get to the end of that list before we can find the other facets, and that feels a little bit clunky to me. And then if we go to a facet that's much shorter, it's disappeared. Right? But all that means is you have to scroll back up to find it, because it's coming from the bottom of the screen, because the bibliographical references facet has closed up. So that's all a little bit clunky, but that's entirely EFES's fault. That's one of the things we do need to improve. But so you can narrow this down by region, and then within region we can narrow it down by period, etc. And perhaps a little bit redundant with period, so I'll remove that facet, is the date slider that we've already got, so you can see the date distribution of her texts and so forth. She's added a couple of new facets, such as mentioned institutions. I don't really know what these mean, but these are the institutions mentioned in her texts, and so if that was what you wanted to filter this by, because that is the aim of her project, she's added that as a facet. Adding a facet or adding an index is, as we've hinted, it's relatively straightforward, and it's fully documented in the file. She's added I think at least one index, but I don't remember which of these indexes are new. I think the prosopographical index maybe wasn't there in base EFES, and so you can look down the list of all the people who appear in the institutional inscriptions, and there's a certain amount of information about each one. So not only their name, but also I guess this is their hometown, and this is any titulature we have for them, and then the text in which they appear. She's also added to this, and this is something that's possible in EFES that we haven't seen so far, a bunch of files which are not EpiDoc files, but that are TEI files containing other kinds of material, and these are the prose sections. These are the large sections of discussion and commentary which are part of the thesis that this corpus is part of. As I say, I don't want to go into too much more detail than that about this site, primarily because I don't know too much more about it, but also because it's in progress work, and I think when Irene publishes this, I think that's when we should see the content of this in full. So I will come back out of that, unless anyone has any questions about this. All I really wanted to do with that is just to show one example of how EFES can be customized and create something that's actually a lot more elegant and professional looking than this raw EFES that we have out of it. And this was done by, I should add, a PhD student who at the beginning of their PhD, so 3 or 4 years ago, was not a programmer or a developer. They're a classics student, not a computing student, and just using skills that sort of a person, a humanities scholar like all of us, was able to teach themselves in the course of their doctoral work. And their doctoral work was on ancient history, not on IT. So they had to do this very much in spare time. So this is, I mean, having said that, Irene is extremely smart on this front. So I don't want to belittle that side of the work, but nevertheless, this is something that is very possible and eminently achievable. So I guess Martina for the second case study.
Yes. So I'll also show a piece of the work which is still very much in progress, and as you can see, we didn't do much CSS customization yet, but we will do it because as for now we are still very much working in the core of the project, and the project, as you can see here, is CGDoc, which is not only an EFES customization, but we are with we, I mean Alessio Sopracasa from Sorbonne University and myself. We are writing an encoding standard and data model for the edition and description of Byzantine, but not only Byzantine seals. And as you can see from the name already, it is kind of based on EpiDoc, and yes, and kind of uses EpiDoc as its main model. So just to show you a little bit what we have done so far, I'll just show the display of the edition of a seal, just to show you what changed from what I showed you before. As you can see, the display is pretty much the same. So we have a title, but of course, since the object that we are working with is not an inscription, so it has different needs, so to speak. We are doing the description and edition of Byzantine seals, which are text-bearing objects with two sides, and they are inscribed on both sides. So this was, for example, the very first challenge. We have two surfaces to cover, and how do we do that in EpiDoc, for example? And that's where a little bit of XSLT came in, but it's actually very easy, and everything will be embedded into the main EFES. So if you will be working with, for example, two-faced epigraphs or inscription or seals or coins, you will find this useful. So we have a whole section of metadata. I'm sorry, with artifact, physical description. We have, for example, another kind of dimensions with respect with the dimensions that you will you will expect from an epigraphic corpus, because we have, for example, the weight, and it's actually very difficult to weight a bulky inscription, but it's easier to weigh a 16.8 gram seal, and so on and so forth. Then we have the dating with dating criteria, as we saw beforehand, and then we have the history of the object with a lot of data. As you can see, a lot of this data is actually unknown, and this is something that we can discuss about. For example, whether the lack of information is per se a piece of information, but we will see. Then we come to the juicy stuff, as I always like to say, because we have the obverse and the reverse, so recto and verso for people dealing with papyrus, so to speak. And we have the layout of the field, the matrix, which is actually the bit which was struck and created the seal. Then we have the description of iconography, which is in this case not applicable because we have inscription on both sides, and so on. We have the text bit with all of the editions, commentary and editions, and edition of the parallels. So pretty much the bibliography. And then we have the image. Let's hope that it will open. Yes, we have the image. And we will also, we are working with the IT and Digital Humanities Department of the Cologne University, that is the Cologne Center for E-Humanities, to try and embed RTI images within EFES. But then we come here to the edition, and as I was anticipating before, we changed the diplomatic edition with a new font, and I will just zoom in, which is called Athena Ruby, and is the standard font for diplomatic edition in Byzantine sigillography and Byzantine numismatics. And this was a small challenge, so to speak. We had to customize a little bit of CSS, and thank God we had someone to give us some inputs, because otherwise it would have been trickier than it was. But everything is nice and fine. And here then you see everything which it's actually expected within an edition. So legend and translation and commentary with cross-references and links to prosopographies or to other seals database. Then you can download the XML, as we already saw. I will just show you a couple of indices. So don't freak out. We have a lot of them, as you can see, but we still have to try and group them by item, so to speak. Let's open the one with dignities, because of course a project dealing with Byzantine stuff will need other kinds of indices than inscriptions from 5th century BCE. Here are the dignities. As you can see here, I didn't harvest well. Not good, but the indices are pretty much the ones that I showed you before, with name of the dignity and reference. You can also, and I didn't show you before, you can also use a very interesting feature of EFES and do a multilingual site. In this case, I just changed the language of the dignities, and as you can see, we want to do our indices in Latin and Greek rather than English and modern languages. And yes, as you can see, they're in alphabetical order with name and reference, as I showed you. And we added pretty much each and every index that you can find here. So according to the needs of your project, you will you can add pretty much everything you want to. And we also changed some facets. And as you can see here, the disadvantage Gabby already talked about. We had the personal name, the dignities, civil office, ecclesiastical offices, and everything that we want to filter our corpus with. So I think it's all from me. I'll just change here. And yes, or is there something more that you would like to know about my seals?
That's lovely. That's the first time I've seen EpiDoc in action, so I'm very happy about that. I mean, we can pull your screen back up if anyone has any specific questions on EpiDoc. I cannot more, but now I won't insist you go through more now. We'll do it some other time. What I was doing at this moment was I was looking at that list of indices, and I was trying to think how many of those do we want back in EFES, native. But we'll have that conversation.
A few,
yeah.
A few of them, definitely.
Yeah.
I think.
Yes, because as I was saying, we need. I mean, we wanted to filter and we wanted to index a lot of information, which has actually different needs from the ones of the one of an epigraphic corpus. That's what brought us to create an overpopulation of indices. But yeah.
Cool. Okay. Shall we switch to Simona briefly to talk about how you would go about customizing EFES further, and then we can come back to talk about some workflow questions in the final few minutes.
Yes, I will be brief since we already saw Martina's walk through the interface and her own customization of EpiDoc. What I want to show you now is where in the documentation do you find the instructions for how to customize and achieve the things that we've just seen in both the Krita and Sigidoc customizations of EFES. So starting again, the wiki page of EFES, where Martina already showed you around. On the right-hand side, you can see there are 32 pages of instructions of how to do various things, from the initial installation to the search interface and everything. So the first thing you might want to do, as Martina already said, is customize this page, the home page. Remove the welcome to EFES, put your own project name, customize the 3 boxes with information, make them 4 boxes or 1 big box or whatever, change the color scheme, etc. That is done from within the EFES files, and I cannot enlarge this window, but from EFES, we go to Web Apps, Root, Assets, and Templates. And within Templates, we see the home.xml file, which contains the XML for this page. And here is where we edit the content of this page, layout, text, etc. In styles, again, root, asset, but not templates, in this case styles, we see the various CSS files where we can change things like colors, fonts, headers and footers and that kind of thing. So that website view customization bit lives in assets.
This is all fairly basic web design.
Yes.
And if you don't know how to do any of that, whoever you would normally ask to design your website for you would know how to do that sort of thing. And it uses a fairly standard web design template. I forget which one it is, but
yeah, it's fairly standard, and it's divided into blocks. So you can see when you open the file, you can see the block which defines the first box, the block which defines the second, etc. So it's really quite easy to actually change bits and pieces without breaking everything. Just follow the hierarchy of the file. Don't overlap boxes, and you should be fine. So that's on the design side of things. Now, if we want to customize the menu, so this bit here, how many indices we display, if we want to transpose the buttons and have the indices first, stuff that Gabby showed you in Irina's Cretan inscriptions. Then we can follow the instructions on the wiki for that. We open, again, in the same folder in assets, we open the file called main.xml, which contains the instructions for the buttons that are the main menu. And you can see that each menu has a label. The label is the word which appears here on the website. So you can change that. You can make it in another language, not English or whatever. And then link to the place where you actually extract that information. It's all explained here with screenshots and example code, and it's quite straightforward to follow. There is also an option to change the admin page. I haven't seen anyone done this yet, because this is a page which the people working behind the scenes of EFES use. That's not a public-facing part of the platform, so I don't see much point unless it's absolutely necessary, but it is possible to customize that as well if something in this layout isn't working for you. Right, so Martina showed you in the addition of a text that we have this interpretive and diplomatic view, for example. So it is possible to switch between them if you only want one of them. It's possible if we have a verse text to display either the epigraphic structure or the verse structure of the text, depending on what we want to do. And this change in the XML display happens through a file called config.xmap, which is located, I will enlarge a bit, which is located in web apps root sitemaps. Everything mostly that you'll need is located in the root. So we always start from the root. As Martina said, it takes a bit of time to get used to the EFES structure, but once you've done it a couple of times, it becomes a habit. So here we can change the type of edition display. We can change the structure of the project. So currently EFES is set up to work with the EOSPE project display structure. We can choose where to put the images in the images folder within EFES or somewhere on a server. And in the second case, this will point to the location of the images on the server, and so on and so forth. So this is something that, again, you can find in the instructions. Now, speaking of EOSPE and displays of texts, and what we saw both in Kreta and SIGDoc, is that each project tends to prefer a specific kind of display. And usually what happens is that people start from an existing style sheet coming from an existing project. For example, we start with the page layout of EOSPE and then customize it slightly or massively, depending on our needs. Following, again, the instructions here, we create a new style sheet based on an old one. We tweak things inside it. We make sure we name things consistently so the file dependencies can work. And then at the end of everything, we reboot. Yes, and this is the code for the parallel display of interpretive and diplomatic, which you see here for this bit. It is possible to only have one, but for most epigraphic editions or generally critical editions, people would like at least to, so that's already here, fairly easy to do. Martina mentioned and showed us her impressive list of indices, and starting from the 7 default ones provided already in EFES, here you can follow a step-by-step instruction on how to create new ones. Again, we recommend that you start from this index that sort of looks like the one you want to create. Copy that file, rename it, and create your own index. If you want to remove one of the existing indices, just comment out that bit of the code as explained here. And yes, here we see the 1, 2, 3 instruction with bits of code. Again, screenshots, very helpful, provided by Paulina for all of us. Connected to the indices is the creation and change of the facets that we saw in the search page. Waiting for my EFES, there you go. So this page, Martina again mentioned that this, of course, entirely customizable, and this happens in a similar fashion to the index creation and change. Again, we have a few default ones provided by EFES. We can remove them by commenting them out. Same as the indices. We can create them again, starting from an existing one, changing, renaming. However, creating a new facet requires a change into the schema file, which is slightly different than customizing other parts of EFES, and that means that we need to restart EFES so the changes can be ingested and then displayed. So again, detailed instructions of how everything is done, including the data slider, which is super cool, as Martina already mentioned. Something else that was touched upon was the possibility of adding multilingual options. both for the menus, as we saw in Irina's Italian edition, and for parts of the encoding of the text. For example, if we look at one of the EOSPE files, we see here the text is in English. However, if we open the XML, we will see that it's actually encoded partly in English and partly in Russian to allow for a bilingual presentation. Well, we shall see if Oxygen opens. If it doesn't, trust me that the file is both in English and in Russian. But to allow this kind of switching between languages for various purposes, EFES has this messages dot something. The asterisk stands for the possibility of renaming the file depending on what bits of EFES you want to make multilingual. And here, Oxygen is nearly done. We see the description of where this file lives. And for example, we say here we see in the catalog, the XML language is English. So the content of the message keys are in English. If we change this to FR, we would expect to see French, and so on and so forth. Oh, there is a sample of the EOSPE file. The ability to display multilingual metadata as well as multilingual bits of our editions. So yes, Oxygen is not loading, so I think I will stop here and we can transition into the discussion of why this is useful, how we go about constructing a workflow and publication strategy.
Cool, thanks, Simona. So just very quickly following on from that, because the setup of EFES itself is already a bit of a step, we've actually suggested that anybody who's following this session as a student, two possible exercises. The first exercise, which is the obligatory exercise, and this is all encoded, given at the bottom of the session page for this week, which I will just quickly put up on the screen there. A bit larger. So the first step of this, the obligatory exercise, is to download a copy of EFES, or if you think you're going to use this, clone a copy of EFES and possibly fork it into your own repository so that you can make changes and you can upload it to your own GitHub space, as you will have created one at the beginning of this semester. And add your EpiDoc files. If you're following the rest of this semester, you will have created at least 3 EpiDoc files 2 weeks ago in the first EpiDoc session. Add those EpiDoc files to the relevant part of the EFES structure, as Martina showed you. Do the repository creation, harvesting, indexing, and so forth, and see that your files appear in the list, see that they might appear in the indexes if you've tagged any features that are indexable. If they don't appear in the indexes and you would have expected them to, try to figure out why. See the things that do appear in the indexes and how they're encoded, and see how yours differ, and see if you can modify them to make them match. Okay, so try and get that working. So that's the obligatory part of the exercise. If you find that too easy, if you do that and everything works, and you make a couple of changes and it's all working, and you think, I set aside 4 hours to do this and that only took me 20 minutes, then the optional part of this exercise is to try to add some more indexing terms, and potentially this might require adding new indexable items in the authority lists. And so you'll have to look in the authority folder that Martina showed you earlier, and you see the authority files for names, places, symbols, and things like this, and you might have to add new items to there. You can simply follow the pattern that's already in there. If they have them in multiple languages in there, feel free to only add them in the languages you understand. Don't feel obliged to add a Russian name for your particular symbol just because all the other symbols have them. And to try to get this working. If you've added anything new to an authority list, remember you'll have to harvest as well before you can index for those to appear. There is a third possibility if you find that part straightforward and you really want to do more, or if you want to do this as part of an assessed exercise, depending on where you're studying this, which we haven't put in the site because this is really really more advanced, which is see if you can figure out how to create a new index to index something that you have tagged in your files that we haven't, the EFES doesn't currently index. That's a bit more challenging. It should be completely manageable, just within the scope of of a one semester exercise. But really, that's only for someone who really wants to have that challenge and wants to see something appearing like that and have their own customized version of EFES. I think that would be very rewarding for anyone who does want to do that. And of course, please feel free to get in touch with all of us and for any guidance or help as you go forward. So I thought sorry for interrupting the discussion part of it, but I thought that was worth saying because that followed on very very clearly from what Simona was just showing us. Most of the point of most of this is that the documentation that Simona showed you gives you lots of information on how to do all of these things. So if you really need to do something, follow that documentation. So we were going to talk a little bit for the last few minutes, bearing in mind that we're a little bit behind schedule already, but just for the last few minutes about a few workflow features of working with EFES, which I guess apply to working with any other XML publication tool as well. Features, such as how do you control your data, how do you collaborate on these things, where would you upload these, how do you, how do you find a team to work with for those parts of it that you don't necessarily know how to do? Other questions than that. Mitko, did you want to add any questions to that list of discussions?
Well, yes. Some stuff that were mentioned before in the presentations of both Simona and Martina. What do we do about the information which is unknown? Because there is a way. EFES makes almost everything customizable, and you are really in control of most of the features. One of the things which you can customize if you wish is the bits and pieces of which you don't have any information. For example, provenance, origin, current location, and so on of the monument. You can choose to just not display them. And we've had this discussion with the project we are working on, the Telamo project of inscriptions from Bulgaria. I believe that Martina and Alessio also have discussed this, as it shows from what she said. But then we decided that the lack of information is also information. So if you choose to suppress the bits and pieces, we just say not applicable, or an empty space or a dash or whatever, then the people who are using your collection wouldn't know if in the description of one particular text-bearing object, if there is a missing description of place of provenance, is this because you just missed to encode it, or because you really don't know? So my goal for this is just to keep it, although it looks quite a bit disturbing, but you have an object of which almost anything is unknown, because we do have objects and they don't look quite nice on the page. But yes, you can do this. And about the
and also because you, if you bear in mind that a lot of your pages will be seen by people outside of the context of the rest of your site. Someone may just be looking at one of your inscriptions, one of your seals, and not going through your entire corpus. And so if there's no information about provenance in there, does that mean you don't encode provenance in your corpus? Or does it mean you just don't know for this one? That's something that would be useful for people to know. So the more transparency there, the better.
Yes, and I think, for example, that I mean, what we will do is that we give the possibility of encoding this kind of information, and then each project will decide how and in which manner to encode it. But for example, I always take the Bulgarian collections of seals as examples, because they are all very well documented, all come from excavations, and we have very precise information about found, I mean, about discoverers, about provenance, about everything. Whereas, for example, the collection I am working with in Cologne is a private collection, and we do not have that kind of information. So we have, as you saw, unknown. But then when we talk about the history of the object, so how it has been purchased, we just wrote a piece of code where we say, okay, this seal was auctioned in this and this auction, and so on and so forth, which is an option that you always have to give to someone working with private collections, because the object might be the same, but the circumstances of of provenance might not be the same. So I think that the broader the possibilities, the better. But then each project should be able to choose. But I always agree with what you said, Mitko, that also the lack of information is information per se. Yeah.
Several other things I would like to point out. First is that as almost everything EpiDoc, EFES is a community. So most of the projects which do EFES have GitHub repositories. So if you spot any cool feature of something which is done with EFES, for example, something that Sunoikisis project has done, something that CGDoc has done, or something like this, it's always an option to ask, okay, how do you manage to display it in this way? And usually there is a solution somewhere in the code, which is more or less all the versions of EFES which are customized are shared via GitHub. And some of them, I believe, are fed back into the general EpiDoc repository, or if not, it's only a matter of time that they are so. And also about multilingual encoding, probably one should think beforehand which side of the template of the XML encoding, of the XML template of encoding separate documents, separate monuments, need to be duplicated with different language values. For example, dimensions of the objects or other physical characteristics, such as weight, which do not contain any language information, need not be duplicated, but EFES and TEI schema in general, EpiDoc and TEI schema in general allows for most of the elements to be duplicated, receiving different language values. So you might need to think beforehand of that. What do you want to display in different ways when you switch between languages? And
yeah, so the language change is not a generic language change across the entire EFES. You have to make the decision because you match each element that you want to allow to be multilingual. So you make that choice when you start customizing that file. Which ones do I match to this language? It's not a general override of the entire.
Yes.
Yes. And even numerical, I mean, just to be cringeworthily pedantic, even numerical fields are language specific, right? Because an English scholar will write 1.2, whereas a continental scholar will often write 1,2, right? Meaning the same thing. So there can be a difference there, and there may be other languages, where they might use a different script that you might want to include, or you might say that in this particular scholarly tradition we use centimeters, but in another scholarly tradition they use meters for exactly the same field, and that actually not following that is a deal breaker for those projects. So when the projects that I've worked on, I've tried to insist, unsuccessfully I should add, that the only field which is not language specific is the apparatus criticus, because the apparatus criticus is always in Latin. Yeah, we say lapis, this, we say all these things in there, and even that, I wasn't able to stop people from insisting on putting Russian in the apparatus criticus.
Well, we do put language content in Bulgarian and English in Telamon, also in the apparatus criticus. So maybe even this is not an absolute truth anyway. But yes, it depends on how you want your material to look on in the electronic edition. And more generally, what shall we say about what can we do with EFES?
Application, I think, is the question that people often have. So if you have, you've customized EFES, you've created lots of new functionality of the kind that we've seen in both EpiDoc and the Cretan inscriptions, and you may have redesigned it, and so you've got a beautiful looking site. Where do you put it, and how do you go about putting it there? So where could be as simple as saying, well, I'm going to rent some server space from a well-known ISP. It'll cost me £20 a year, and I can just put my files up there. If you had plain HTML files, you could do that. If you just had a WordPress site, you could do that. Can you just load EFES straight up there? And
no.
What are the further changes that need to be made?
Well, I've tried doing this with our collection, and it says that, well, the people who are the web developers of the web page of my department, when I tried to put it, said that currently the server is not configured in a way to handle dynamic content, so it wouldn't load the EFES in with all these features right away. Just displayed a list of folders.
So this again, this is a case of a more generic problem, which is that for everything that we said, you have to make sure is true for your own computer for EFES to work. So the right version of Java, various other things installed, and that you have permission to install things. If you don't have admin rights on your own computer, then you can't install certain things. All of that is true of has to be true of the server as well. You can run EFES on any computer so long as you have sufficient admin creds to do so. If you don't have admin creds on your server, either because you're buying some cheap server space that they don't want to give you that, or if you're putting it on a university server, they almost certainly won't give you admin credentials. You'll have to go through someone else every time you want to make that level of change. And some levels they may refuse. They might say, well, I'm not installing Java 8 on here. That's not supported anymore. That doesn't meet our security policies. So those are the issues that you're faced with. That even once you've got all of that resolved, you've upgraded your server space, so you're now paying more for it, and they will allow you to install Java and various other things on there. All these other things that you finally got it working technically. What do you have to do to, for example, turn off the admin or put a password in front of the admin section of the site, so that anybody looking at your web page can't just click on it and destroy your triple store, or re-index your site every 19 times a second, causing you to go down under bandwidth failure. What sort of things are required? And I don't know the answer to these things, but if we had a list of what do you need to tell the internet service provider in order for them to give you a quote, what do I need to be able to do on this server? That would be a really useful list.
Well, what we did with Telamon, we had to hire a web developer at the end, but at a very, very lower cost that we would have done if we didn't have EFES up and running. He just made it be. He just deployed it using Docker from the GitHub repository. It is generated directly from the GitHub repository, but there are other options available. For example, he could have put it into their own servers, and he hosts it in a way that we all have different access levels, and the general public won't have access level to the admin page. But we will be able to have operate this directly on the server, and then we will just make it redirect to our institutional web page. But it wasn't able to run properly there, precisely because of some of the features you mentioned. Generally, very heavy institutional servers don't have the security requirements right for you to be allowed to run your EFES collection directly. But who knows, the conditions are different everywhere. So maybe if you have your own little department or a research lab server, it may be a bit easier for you in direct contact with the people who are in charge. And they can tell you if something is not running properly. Is it because of a server security feature, or is it because of your EFES not behaving properly on a distant server, which might happen. It happens all the time, actually. When I run our Telemon EFES locally, it behaves differently than when I run it distantly on the server on which it is up now. But this is the solution that we've achieved until now. I hope it's sustainable for the time being. I don't know about other projects.
Maybe worth saying a thing or two about the concept of server. The server software is the layer that turns all the code behind EFES into something that can be deployed in a web browser. That is what enabled the web view of this that Martina showed us, that was running locally on her machine, and so she pointed to localhost Köln and then the address. That EFES natively comes with a very lightweight server called Jetty, which is nevertheless it's powerful enough for almost anything we might want to do with EFES. If we had tens of thousands of inscriptions, it might get a bit heavy for Jetty, and we might want to think about a more, a much more industrial scale server. But I think Jetty is absolutely fine for every corpus I've seen. A slightly more commonly used server is Apache Tomcat, which some people use, and there's no reason why you couldn't strip out Jetty and replace it with Apache. That'd be fairly straightforward. Your developer Midco used Docker as the server, as I understand it, and so there's various other options in there. I would keep Jetty unless my host insisted that they don't support Jetty. And that would be straightforward. Ideally, if I've got all the settings right, and I've just made some small changes, which would presumably be changes at the Apache level, at the server level, to password protect the admin site or whatever, I would just have a Git clone of my EFES install onto the server. And then when I wanted to update it, I could just go into, I wouldn't even need to go to FTP anything to my server. I would just go into my server via a command line and just type, pull, git pull, and that would update it on the server, and then you could refresh the browser and it would be there. We don't always have that much freedom on the server to do that. There's a lot of questions coming up here that we have, we don't currently have solutions to. I would love if this conversation led to an improvement of the page on server hosting requirements on the EFES documentation wiki, which is currently semi-populated.
I would like to point out that sorry to interrupt you, that there's other ways you can use your EFES before you figure out how to publish your collection online. You don't even have to. You can. I know researchers, and that are using it locally as a desktop application for their collection of inscriptions or seals or coins or whatever. In order to, when properly encoded, you can see trends in your collections that you don't necessarily see with the naked eye. So it's a very good way of visualizing and operating with information.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Another thing which is an achievement by itself, you can make a very neat and pretty small data set of something and publish it on your GitHub page, or for that matter in some of the journals which I think were shown in the first session. For example, Journal of Open Humanities Data, or some other publishing venue like this. And you can have your nice and pretty data set of something, and you can simply add it, incorporate it into EFES as a way of visualizing the stuff for anybody who would like to just download your data and use it and manipulate them and things like that, which is for the time being, before you figure out something that which all the projects have to figure out by themselves. It's a great
and you might decide not to publish it in a deployed, polished version, because actually having a downloadable version is more sustainable. Because people can download it and take it away and use it. And even when EFES stops working because some of the underlying software no longer works, which could happen. I mean, maybe not, hopefully not in the next 5 years, but certainly in the next 20 years, if we haven't done some serious redevelopment of the underlying infrastructure, the existing infrastructure will not survive the changes to computing and to the web in the next number of years, which is going ever faster, as we know. So just making the base data downloadable they'll at least be able to open the XML files and read the documentation and see how it looks, even if they can't deploy the server anymore. Whereas if you're just deploying it on a website, the polished final version, it may just disappear once things stop working.
Yeah, I'd say that's much more important than producing a pretty and wonderful website in the end. And that's one of the reasons why, by default, in EFES, you can download each individual file or the data dump of all the files together.
Right, but if EFES has gone down, then you can't find that button.
Unless you publish them on GitHub.
Unless you put them somewhere else as well.
Yes, exactly. So don't keep your eggs in one basket.
It's also worth pointing out that some people do exactly as both Simona pointed out at the beginning, use this as a workflow tool as they go along, and as a way of distributing it, as Mitko said, and then publish it in some other way, publishing it using some other tool other than EFES. EFES can still be useful even if that's not going to deliver your publication, because it is, it's something you look at as you go along, and it does help you find errors, helps you proofread, and also helps you look at patterns in your own data, as Mitko said. Especially once we add more visualization features later down the road, this will become even more powerful for that sort of work. We're very much overrunning. I just wanted to ask if Martina, from the SIGDoc perspective, had any other questions that workflow questions, long-term questions about how the questions you need to answer about the way you use EFES that you wanted to throw on the table.
I think we pretty much have the very big question of how to put it, running online, and we are, trying to work on it. So thank you for all the input that you gave us. But I also think that we should write a pretty thorough documentation on that, because it's actually the most important thing. I mean, why people get into EFES is, otherwise I can just encode my files and then don't see them displayed anyway. But for now, I don't have any questions, but I think that we will get back to you with a lot more. But yes, I think that's, the questions that we always have, for example, how to alphabetize indices properly, or yes, how to embed some things into the EpiDoc schema, but they are more general question and not actually EFES related. So I think it's this is not the place for discussing them, I think.
Sure. Cool. No, thank you. That's useful. Cool. Then in that case, thank you all very much. This has been a really valuable session, really informative. and I hope the students all think so too, those who are still watching, or who have to watch. And thank you. We'll keep this conversation going. A quick reminder for those watching that next week's session will be the first of 2 sessions on tree banking, where Polina Yordanova and Vanessa Gorman. Polina is the same Polina who is the main documenter of EFES that you'll have seen, you heard about this week, will be showing us how to create morphosyntactic annotations of Greek and Latin texts. So please join us again next week for that. Thanks a lot and bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.